Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 140. The history of the United States is complicated and multifaceted, and it's not all negative and terrible. Over the last few decades, though, the wounds of the people of the United States have been opened and explored again by some for the purposes of writing polemics and protest nonfiction. And others in the United States have opted not to explore any of this at all. Your point of interest in exploration depends and will depend very greatly on your starting point. And everyone starts at a different point on the map. But this is not a new exploration in the long cultural history of the American Republic. As a matter of fact, once every 20 years or so, right on time like clockwork, an ethnic generation of Americans, an entire generation of Americans, is suddenly mugged by the reality of life with other ethnic groups on the same continental spread. Occasionally, though, you will get writing, clear-eyed and trenchant analysis from people who lived through the previous great, quote-unquote, yop 20 years previous, and may provide wisdom, anchoring, and explanation that is appreciated by critics, ignored by activists, and exploited by political opportunists, all of whom invariably and blindly miss the point. The author we're reading today, whose seminal essays and books about race, culture, and class in the United States were written from the viewpoint of someone who had been through all of the younger generation's outrage before in his own time and was promptly ignored in his own time, much like contemporaries Thomas Sowell and Shelby Steele were ignored, and Glenn Lowry was ignored about 10 years later. And now in our own time, folks like Adam B. Coleman and Coleman Hughes are ignored. Today on the show, we will be pulling leadership lessons. We will be culling leadership lessons from a long essay that's actually a book, and it reads part of a longer argument for the Americanness, and I'm making up a word there, that lies deeply embedded in all of us, trapped by geography together on this continent, whether we like it or not. Today, we will be reading from the Library of American version of Albert Murray's The Omni-Americans. Leaders, the transference of racial and cultural wisdom based on life experience and book knowledge across generations continues to be a challenge for which there seems to be no immediate solution. And of course, today on our podcast, we were just talking about this before we hit the record button, we are joined by our co-host, Tom Libby. How you doing, Tom?
I am living my best life, Hassan. Loving it.
Awesome. Well, normally, Tom does not join us on Black History Month. Not because Tom doesn't have anything to say about Black history, but because normally we have DeRollo Nixon joining us. But unfortunately, DeRollo was taken away by other obligations for the remainder of the month. And so I reached out to Tom and asked him if he would like to show up today while we cover Murray here. Again, an individual that, which should not surprise any of our regular listeners, an individual who he had not heard of before this episode today. Nor had he read any of his work, but that's okay.
Hey, listen, I spent a little time doing some research on this guy. I will tell you, from all of the I must have one thing I let me just back up for a second. One thing I love about this episode that we're doing right now is this gentleman was alive in this century. He'd passed away in 2013, which which was interesting for me because the first picture I saw of him when I looked him up, I was like, I know this dude. Like I was like, I don't know why. Because again, as you anybody who's listened to this podcast will know, it's not like I'm a screaming literary expert. Like I'm not like, but for some reason I knew who he was and I was like, I know this dude. Like, why do I know him? And it took me forever to realize it was his ties to music that I realized that's where I knew him from because he was a really very well written critic of blues and jazz and things like that. And so that was like, I knew his face, and I was like, that's where I know him from. So anyway, I ended up watching a bunch of interviews from him over the weekend. So he's going on my list of people I would love to have lunch with if I were to pick somebody from history. I just like listening to him talk. I really enjoyed listening to his interviews and stuff like that. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, no, he was known for, and it really is in this essay that we're going to read today, the Omni-Americans. He made his argument really first that jazz, and we'll talk a little bit about this today, but the jazz is the fundamental, unique representation of America.
Yeah,
Specifically,
the art form
yeah,
that America created. Yeah,
exactly, and that the Europeans couldn't have done it. Africans couldn't have done it. Asians couldn't have done it. We're the only ones that could have put that together on this continent by virtue of how we think about ourselves. And that's an interesting perspective to explore, particularly in light of jazz critics like Stanley Crouch, who would come later on, and even jazz players who eventually became critics like Wynton Marsalis, who, you know, maybe took a little bit of a different approach to thinking about the jazz medium. The other dynamic is I'm a big fan of jazz music, and so I knew about this guy a while ago, but I hadn't had a chance to really fully explore all of his writing and all of his work. And so for this podcast, I did a deep dive into him as well. In addition to reading his essay, "The Omni-Americans," which we're going to cover today, I also looked at his other book, which I really do enjoy, "South to a Very Old Place," which I love that title. It's very Faulknerish. Love that title.
he
But
references Faulkner a lot in his interviews too.
he does, and the interview link that I sent you from the
Yeah,
interview that he did in 1996. Um, it's interesting sort of how the interviewer is trying to pull him into something, with the questions, and he just refuses to go there.
doesn't bite. Yeah, I saw that too. I realized that as well. It was
Yeah,
interesting.
I love that. It means well, and what it indicates to me is that he knew exactly, well, and we'll talk about his literary life here, but he knew exactly who he was, and he
Sharp.
knew exactly what he was about.
Yeah, very sharp too. Very sharp.
Yep, absolutely. All right, let's go ahead and jump in to the Omni-Americans. We're going to pick up in the section labeled Paleface Fables, Brown Skin People. And I quote, "The self-conception in terms of which most Negroes have actually lived and moved and had their personal being for all these years, however, has always been, as they say, something else again. Perhaps self-indulgence causes white people to public outcry against the fact that a document whose statistics are at times clearly ridiculous and whose central assumptions and embarrassingly sloppy conclusions make a travesty of scientific methodology is by way of becoming a veritable handbook of race relations in some parts of the country." Now, pause. He was talking about and writing in response to the Moynihan report, which was released in the 1960s, and which described the decline of the decline of um, inner city Black families in Chicago, Detroit, and up north, and then was tying this into larger challenges of segregation in America. And by the way, that report was made by a gentleman who at the time I believe was a senator or would later become a senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So when he says the report, that's what he's talking about. Okay, back to this. But then not very many Negro social science technicians have come forth to even take issue with Dark Ghetto either. Not even those ever so prideful Black nationalistic spokesmen who otherwise display so much suspicion about becoming victims of brainwashing, whitewashing, and who express so much militant concern about improving, quote unquote, the black man's image in America, seem in the least aware of the fact that almost every chapter of Dark Ghetto not only supports the stereotype that Negroes have always been extremely sensitive about, but also provides a quasi-scientific refutation of the very elements of Negro American history upon which contemporary Negro leaders must build. Dark Ghetto, which is strong on political indictment, but as will be seen, weak on psychological insight, represents Negroes as substandard human beings who insist in a sick community, who subsist in a sick community. Its image of Harlem is, in effect, that of an urban pit writhing with derelicts. According to the impression the author creates, even if his figures do not, Black despair has driven most of its inhabitants either to crime, narcotics, addiction, prostitution, and the like, or to obsessive imitations of something which he calls, quote unquote, the white man's society. Few, if any, Negroes, he goes so far as to claim, ever lose that sense of shame, being dark skinned and self hatred. The obsession with whiteness, he adds, continues past childhood and into adulthood. It stays with the Negro all his life. It is extremely difficult to believe, italics added, it is extremely difficult to believe that the evidence that Dark Ghetto presents in support of such sweeping generalization would meet the scientific standards of, say, Talcott Parsons, who cannot fail to note that Clark's overestimation of white well-being is almost worshipful. I'm going to go back a little bit and read this. The nature of Negro moral outcry polemics, it should also be remembered, is now such that the most glibly self-confident and even the most smugly chauvinistic Black spokesmen and leaders readily and frequently refer to themselves as being fear-ridden, emasculated, and without self-respect. No wonder white Americans continue to be so shocked and disoriented by the intensification of the civil rights struggle. Instead of relying on what is now known about the nature of social uprisings, white Americans keep allowing themselves to expect the theoretical Sambo, promised as it were by Stanley M. Elkins in Slavery, a Problem in America, Institutional and Intellectual Life, implicitly confirmed by the pronouncements of Kenneth Clark in Dark Ghetto, and conceded by so much self-deprecating rhetoric. But what these same white Americans keep running up against is such a bewildering, outrageous, and to some of them terrifying behavior as the intransigent determination of leaders like Charles Evers in Mississippi, the mockery and high camp of media types like H. Rap Brown on all networks, and people like those in Watts, Newark, and Detroit, who respond to the murderous hysteria of white police and National Guardsmen with a defiance that is often as derisive as it is deep-seated. The compulsions nourished by the folklore of white supremacy seem to be such that white Americans are as yet unable to realize that they themselves are obviously far more impressed by their own show of brute force than Black insurgents ever seem to be. They still do not seem to realize that what they actually see on television during all of the demonstrations, and as the saying goes, civil disruptions, is not a herd of wall-eyed Black natives cringing before white authority. What they see are heavily armed, outraged, and slaughter-prone white policemen and soldiers smoldering with rage and itching to perpetrate a massacre, confronting Negroes who are behaving not only as if the whole situation were a farce and a carnival, but also who have time to grant television interviews in which there is as much snap course social science jargon as street corner hip talk. Like it's either upward mobility or burn, baby, burn. As one character in For Whom the Bell Tolls, shaking his head, kept saying of the Spanish during the Civil War, quote, what a people, unquote. Indeed, as Negroes are forever saying in delighted puzzlement of each other, my people, ain't nothing like them. Man, when you're talking about us, you're talking about something else. And this is where we begin with Albert Murray and the Omni-Americans. Now, as usual on this show, we're going to do a little bit of a dive into Albert Murray and into his literary life. We're going to sort of explore a little bit about about who he was and where he came from. So Albert L. Murray born May 12th, 1916, died August 18th, 2013, was an American literary and music critic, novelist, essayist, and biographer. His books include The Omni-Americans, which we're reading today, South to a Very Old Place, and Stomping the Blues. By the way, I'd recommend picking up Stomping the Blues if you're a fan of blues music as well. He attended Tuskegee Institute on scholarship and received a BS in education in 1939. One of his fellow students was Ralph Ellison, who would later write the novel Invisible Man, published in 1952, who we covered on the podcast last year. Go find that episode. In 1941, he married Moselle Menefee. They had a daughter, Michelle. While based at Tuskegee, he completed additional graduate work at Northwestern University in 1941, and, interestingly enough, at the University of Paris in 1951. After briefly returning to his position at Tuskegee, he became a member of the Active Guard Reserve in 1951. Over the next decade, Murray was stationed in a number of locales, ranging from Morocco to California to Massachusetts, and taught a geopolitics course in the Tuskegee ROTC program. In 1962, after a doctor's exam revealed signs of heart disease, he retired from the United States Air Force as a major. Murray did not publish his first book until 1970. The Omni-Americans, which again we're reading today, contained a series of essays and reviews on such topics as protest literature and the Moynihan Report on Black poverty. In the introduction, he wrote that, quote, I love this quote, and this is what encouraged me to pick this book up today. The United States is in actuality not a nation of Black people and white people. It is a nation of multicolored people. I love that. Tom, what can leaders glean from the life and times of Albert L. Murray?
That's a question to start with.
Yeah, well,
let me just say first things first, right? Like I think if you think about the time frame that he actually lived through and what that man saw in his life. Like if we can't learn from him, like what are we doing here, people? Like seriously. Like think about like again, like from Jim Crow to the like the civil rights movement to like he's seen so much. It just even if he wasn't a great writer, just a person who's lived through all of that. Again, whether it was black, white, red, brown, whatever, like just think of the sheer amount that we could learn from those people, and whether or not we choose to do so or not is actually the bigger question to me. Like, why would we not? But yet we constantly discount, discredit, or push aside people who are in that age group. And again, today we're probably not seeing anybody that was born in in 1916 anymore. And now it's like we're pushed 20 years past that. So now it's people in the born in the 30s. But again, but I think we can learn a lot from him. I mean, one thing that I know, I don't remember if we had hit the record button or on the podcast yet or not, but one of the things that you and I were talking about on the fact that this man knew who he was. He didn't deviate from his principles. He had a moral compass that was clear to him, and he never allowed anybody to to overshadow or to skew his visibility of that moral compass. If you can't, as a leader, take just from that alone, then you shouldn't be a leader. So I mean, again, even from the simplicity of it, and I'm again not even to go into deep conversation about the type of person he was and the interactions he had with the people around him, and as you mentioned, you took a deep dive into it. I ended up watching at minimum 3 speeches that were given about him from people that he impacted their lives. There was two black gentlemen and a white gentleman, all 3 of which referred to him as their grandfather.
Right.
Because that's the kind of person he was. If you were in with him, you were in with him. It wasn't like he didn't keep from what I gathered from him, there was basically 2 people on this earth, people in his inner circle and people who weren't. And that was it. Like, I don't think he really had that. So to answer your question, to go back to like, what can we learn from him as a leader? I think that's very compelling. Like, he was overly trusting of the people in his inner circle. He valued them beyond belief. He looked he looked to teach them and to learn from them. He looked to, like, there was a lot with him. And there was one person in particular, this gentleman was talking about, he couldn't find a babysitter for his 4-year-old son, and he had to bring him to Mr. Murray's house. And he went, like, he sat his son down, like, for this long conversation, say, don't touch anything, don't look at anything, don't do it. Like, this person, like, is not used to having little kids in his house. And at the end of the visit with Murray, the little boy tugged his father's jacket and said, you said to treat this house like grandpa's house. Like, how do I say goodbye? Like, do I shake his hand? Do I just wave? And when he turned and told Albert Murray that conversation that the little boy had to him, Albert Murray literally opened his arms and just grabbed the little boy and hugged him. Like, it's the first time he ever met the kid, and he treated him like a grandson, like, right out the gate. Like, and it's not that he didn't see, and I say, I got to be careful how I word this, because, like I said, a couple of the people that I watched, like, some were black, some were white. Like, and it's not that he didn't see color. He saw the difference in their color, but he just didn't care. Like, it was that the color, it's not that the color wasn't important or that it didn't matter. It was more about the color not being the reason,
Right.
for whatever, right? Like,
Right.
whether the reason for good, the reason for bad, the reason for what. He just didn't allow the color to be the reason.
Right.
But he appreciated all of it. Like, I found him fascinating. The more, and like I said, it didn't matter whether people were white, black, brown, whether people were male or female. Every person that I heard in the interviews that I listened to over the weekend, and like I said, there was quite a few. I listened to, because I listened to them on 1.75, by the way. I was able to get through literally like a dozen interviews with him over the weekend. And
Yeah.
or not interviews with him, sorry. I listened to the interview that you sent me, but I also was listening to people give speeches on his behalf, whether it was accolades or introductions to an award that he won or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just seemed like, and again, like I said to you earlier, I'm putting him on my list of people. Like, when you
Yeah.
say, like, if you can talk to anybody in history, like, whatever, note any time frame, I would love to talk to him. I think he would be fascinating to just sit and have a conversation with.
I was exposed to him because I'm a fan of jazz music, right? And so I haven't really talked about this on the podcast in a long time, but my wife and I co-founded a jazz festival in our local town, because we're fans of jazz music, we're fans of jazz musicians. We like hanging out with them and talking with them. We even bring our kids around them because they tend to be, because of the nature of jazz music, and Albert Murray would agree with this, because of the nature of jazz music, there's no room for, at least not in my time, there's no room for prejudice or discrimination. There's just not. Like, you're either good or you're not, right? And it doesn't matter if you're, it doesn't matter if you're an Asian cat. It doesn't matter if you're, if you're black. It doesn't matter if you're white. It doesn't matter if you're Native American. Does not matter. Can you blow? Can you play the drums? Can you bump on the cello? Can you do the thing that needs to be done in an improvisational sort of environment, right? And what I loved about Murray was he took that concept, and I don't know whether it came first or came second. And when I studied his life, one of the interesting things that I noted was he didn't stay in America. He went other places. And so he broadened his geopolitical worldview and frame to include folks from other places, right? And I think, just like with a lot of people who struggle, right, to navigate the racial and ethnic waters in America, you don't really realize, black or white or whatever, you don't really realize how unique America is until you have to go someplace else.
Yeah.
And going from, Morocco to Massachusetts is going to give you that kind of education. You're going to see that. You're going to see how Arabs treat other Arabs, right? You're going to see how Germans treat other Germans. You're going to see how Russians treat other Russians. And you're going to be able to put that into a context, I think, that is going to influence, or not influence, but you're going to put it in a context that's going to change how you think about being an American. And then the improvisational pieces from jazz come over because, and this is we talk about this every year in July when we talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I'm going to repeat it here because it's worth repeating. The thing that unites all of us as Americans, the thing that brings us all together, um, regardless of our skin color or ethnicity or even religion, is a common creed. And Murray talks about this in the Omni-Americans. We consistently are asking, as people in America, we are asking America to live up to the words of its founding. And we are constantly pushing the words of its founding, um, and constantly critiquing and poking and improvising around those words. And
And
so,
interpreting.
hmm,
And interpreting those words.
and interpreting those words, correct, right? Well, that goes along with the improvisation. That's all part of jazz, is that interpretation. And so, I found it interesting that one of his fellow students was Ralph Ellison. The two giant black literary figures of the 1950s were Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright. And those two guys, I won't say they were big fans of each other, but they operated in two different spheres, kind of like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And we talked a little bit about that on this podcast as well. But Murray was seeking to, I think, make a broader argument about the nature of what it means to be American while avoiding the easy trap of, well, it's just this race, or it's just that race, or it's just this era, just avoiding the easy traps. And so he's intellectually challenging to read because you can see him improvising as he's writing, and you can see it in the Omni-Americans. Um, okay, one other.
Can we just talk about too, like, isn't it? It was like amazingly fascinating to me that to find out that when he taught at Tuskegee,
Mhm.
that he taught the Tuskegee Airmen. I was like, that just blew my mind. I was like, wait, what? Like this guy, he was their professor, he was their teacher. I was like, that was just crazy to me. That's
Well, he
that's so
was,
cool.
he was in that generational intergurnum between World War I and World War II, right? He was born in that period.
Yeah,
And that's the period, and most people in America don't really think about this, black or white, but that was the period of black people experiencing black excellence at the sort of the post Civil War height, right, of black excellence, which was the Harlem Renaissance, right?
yeah,
Um, Seeing black people from jazz players, speaking of jazz players, from jazz players to football players, right? Or not football, sorry, baseball and basketball players, from boxers to drug dealers, right? Everybody was seeking to be excellent, um, not in opposition to white people, but but encased in their own identity, right? We don't need to define ourselves in opposition because we just are. By the way,
right,
Zora Neale Hurston came out of that milieu too, in
right,
her writing "In Their Eyes Were Watching God."
right.
Um, okay, let me ask you this question, because this is going to lead into what does it mean to be an American? Because I want to talk about this, because this is fundamentally the question that Murray really pokes at. Um, In the introduction to the Omni-Americans, as I already mentioned, Murray stated, quote, "The United States is in actuality not a nation of black people and white people. It is a nation of multicolored people." What do you think about that?
Well, it's funny. It's funny that because I read that quote as well, and I found it fascinating because and those of you who have listened to this podcast before have probably known that I've done a lot of lectures at the local colleges and universities here, mostly on Native American history and culture. And I tell the audience all the time, if your family has been in the United States for more than 5 generations, you're probably multicultural at this point, whether you know it or not, or whether you buy into it or not, or not buy into it, but like or live it, meaning like it's almost impossible for, let's say, Irish or Italian families to come over here for 5 whole generations and continue to marry into their own race. It's almost
Right.
impossible, right? So like, so if you've been here now, think about like, so my family's been here since the 1600s, like the white side of my family. You're telling me from 1600 till now we didn't intermarry with anybody else but people from there's no way. So I'm assuming that if you take my 23andMe is probably going to look like one of the like a cylinder, like a colander with all the holes in it. Like I couldn't even imagine the how wide of the variety of races and cultures would be in my history if I were to look at it that intently.
Right.
So, to your question, I found this fascinating because I think it in my brain it kind of it speaks directly to my own narrative, right? Like the whole idea of like the color of your skin does not dictate who you are. The
Right.
history of your family dictates more of it than anything. So again, for all I know, I could have black relatives back in the day, like at some point back. Not that I identify as black, and I wouldn't do that as a matter of um as a matter of my own identity, but it's and I certainly wouldn't say because let's just say I don't know, let's say it's 7 generations back that there was a black person in there somewhere. I would never in a million years say that I understood the plight of the black person because 7 generations ago I had somebody married into a black. I mean, that's
Sure.
ridiculous. That doesn't have. But to his point and to what I was trying, like the way I'm trying to wrap this into my brain is, but I can still look at that ancestor 7 generations back, regardless, black, white, red, brown, and still say they were American. I know they were because that's how long my family has been here. So
Hmm.
I can look at my own genetic makeup and see exactly what he's talking about because I could very easily and again those of you who know me and if you're looking at this video, I
Hmm.
could very easily discount and discredit my entire native heritage and just say that I'm white. It'd be
Right.
very easy for me to do. I don't think that serves me anything, but I could. And I think that's kind of what he was talking about. At least again, what I'm looking at it. If you think of the black people in the United States today, regardless of the actual color of their skin, if their history goes back to the slave days, then or back before, and it,
Hmm.
again, 7 generations, whatever, you're just American now. Like
Right.
I like if you consider yourself Irish American or Italian American, both of your parents are probably Italian. Both of your parents are probably Irish. They both either your grandparents came over on the boat or like, sure, I get that. But if you say you're Irish American or Italian American, and your family's been here since 1802, come on. You're not Irish American anymore. You're just American. Let's
Just
just be
American.
realistic about this. Like,
Well,
so,
yeah, let's be realistic about this. Let's hear what Murray has to say about this because he hits this right early. He does. He hits this right early in the Omni-Americans. So let me pick up here. And he says this, and I quote, thus, though recognizing that the depths, which after all are bottomless, have not yet actually been plumbed, there is no truly urgent reason to trace the origin of U.S. Negro style and manner any farther back in time than the arrival of a Dutch ship of war in Virginia with a cargo of 20 black captives for sale in 1619, if indeed that far. By the way, that's where the 1619 project comes in. Negroes definitely were reluctant immigrants to the New World, but in view of the life they had experienced in the land of their origin, they could hardly have regarded it as a stronghold of individual freedom and limitless opportunity. Nor could they have been unmindful of the obvious fact that Africans, quote unquote, back home were as actively engaged in the slave trade as were the Europeans and Americans. By the way, we have to point that out. Many contemporary Americans, both black and white, obviously assume that the slave runners simply landed their ships and overpowered the helpless natives at will. Such was not the usual case at all. For the most part, such entrepreneurs bartered for quote unquote black ivory, much as the same for elephant tusks. The whites, Negro historian Benjamin Quarles points out, did not go into the interior to procure slaves. This they left to the Africans themselves. Spurred on by the desire for European goods, one tribe raided another, seized whatever captives it could, and marched them in coffles with leather thongs around their necks to coastal trading centers. It is all too true that Negroes, unlike the Yankee and the backwoodsman, were slaves whose legal status was that of property. But it is also true, as things have turned out even more significant, that they were slaves, and this is what he italicizes, who were living in the presence of more human freedom and individual opportunity than they or anybody else had ever seen before. That the conception of being a free man in America was infinitely richer than any notion of individuality in the Africa of that period goes without saying. That's a bombshell, by the way, of a statement right there.
Yeah, it really is.
That's a bombshell of a statement. Like when I read that, I went, oh, 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 and I highlighted that because that's a bombshell of a statement that most people don't think about. Back to the book. That this conception was perceived by the black slaves as shown by their history as Americans. And now he's going to back up his statement. The fugitive slave, for instance, was culturally speaking certainly an American and a magnificent one at that. His basic urge to escape was, of course, only human, as was his willingness to risk the odds. But the tactics he employed, as well as the objectives he was seeking, were American, not African. In his objectives, he certainly does not seem to have been motivated by any overwhelming nostalgia for tribal life. The slaves who absconded to the fight for the British during the Revolutionary War were no less inspired by American ideas than those who fought for the colonies. The liberation that the white people wanted from the British, the black people wanted from white people. By the way, I laughed when I read that. As for as for the tactics of the fugitive slaves, the Underground Railroad was not only an innovation, it was also an extension of the American quest for democracy, brought to its highest level of epic heroism. Nobody tried to sabotage the Mayflower. Just pointing that out. There was no bounty on the heads of its captain, crew, or voyagers, as was the case with all conductors, station masters, and passengers on the northbound Freedom Train. Given the differences in circumstances, equipment, and above all motives, the legendary exploits of white U.S. backwoodsmen, keelboatmen, and prairie schoolmen, for example, became relatively safe when one sets them beside the breathtaking escapes of the fugitive slave beating his way south to Florida, west to the Indians, and north to faraway Canada through swamp and town alike, seeking freedom. Nobody was chasing Daniel Boone. Or, to take another area of American experience, the pioneer spirit of American womanhood is widely eulogized, but at no time in the history of the Republic has such womanhood ever attained a higher level of excellence than the indomitable heroism of a runaway slave named Harriet Tubman, who kidnapped more than 300 of her fellow men out of bondage, and of whom William H. Seward once said, quote, a nobler, higher spirit or a truer seldom indwells in human form, close quote. Harriet Tubman was, like Sojourner Truth, already a legend in her time. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott. By the way, Bronson Alcott, I believe, was the father of Louise May Alcott, the author of Little Women, and Horace Mann, among numerous others of that golden era of national synthesis, immediately and eagerly acknowledged what the dynamics of racial one-upsmanship have obscured for so many succeeding students of American civilization. Tubman was not only an American legend, she also added a necessary, even if still misapprehended, dimension to the national mythology. Another example in such an epical figure as that of the mulatto fugitive, abolitionist, and statesman named Frederick Douglass, contemporary American Negroes can find all the fundamental reassurances as to their identity and mission as Americans that the Joseph of Thomas Mann found in the man from Ur Kasdim. Indeed, not even such justly canonized founding fathers as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson represent a more splendid image and pattern for the contemporary American citizenship of anyone. On balance, not even Abraham Lincoln was a more heroic embodiment of the American as self-made man. After all, Lincoln, like Franklin and Jefferson, was born free. I am reading this book, and I want to fully acknowledge this, as we are in the middle of what the writers on Substack and the folks on Twitter call a vibe shift. But I think it's more like the ending of a political realignment. And by the way, our political parties go through this once every 80 years. 80 years ago, Democrats were, quite frankly, not that great. And Republicans were, quite frankly, on the side of civil rights. And there was a shift that occurred. And Democrats became very much in favor of civil rights, and Republicans backburnered that as a secondary consideration to making money. And now we are having another shift 80 years later, where 80 years on from the civil rights movement, where Republicans have captured, if not almost all as a party, a lot of the territory of civil rights action. And if you don't believe me, if you're looking for actual lived evidence of this, both the 45th president of the United States and the 47th president of the United States increased funding for historical Black colleges and universities by the stroke of an executive pen. and did it without any fanfare. The Democratic president in between just kind of passed on it when it was offered to him. There has been a shift in politics, but it takes a while for it to show up. And when political realignments happen in chaotic turnings like the one we're at the end of, we always, as a people, ask the question that we've all been asking for the last 20 years of chaos. What does it really mean to be a quote unquote American? Now, I'm going to have a position on this, and Tom is going to have a position on this based on, as I said in my opening, where you stand on the map, right? Where you're starting from with the territory. But we also ask this question when activists upheaval from populations demanding that America as a political entity live up to the promises of its founding. And when those calls begin to spread, as they were doing when Albert Murray was in his 40s and 50s from a younger generation of African American activists, when those questions begin to spread, we also get political upheavals and realignments. But Murray figured out something that I think most of us have to remember. And I think we will remember it as we come out of this chaos and on the other side of it by 2028 or so. The very people of the United States live in tension. This is what Murray meant by we're not a nation of Black people or white people. We're a nation of multicolored people. That's how he framed the tension. And we don't want to look at the hard truth. And the hard truth is this: all of us humans on this continent, within this political and cultural entity known as the United States, regardless of skin color, ethnicity, or even religion, demand that we be treated as amorphous and undefinable, and specifically that species of human known as American. We can't define it, but we want to be treated that way. Even to Tom's point and Tom's background, even the folks who were here when all of us showed up on ships and started doing what people do when they show up to new lands, just walking around making trouble and spreading around.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Albert Murray has hit on a truth there, right? Like I always ask this question whenever an activist yells at me, and they do all the time. We're gonna do the color purple here coming up. They're gonna yell at me because of my take on that. It's fine. Where are we gonna go? Like, to your point about Irish, Italian, whatever. Like, nobody who claims to be an Irish descent is going back to Ireland for any reason whatsoever.
Let's visit.
Right, maybe have a Guinness and kiss the Blarney Stone. It's a tour.
You gotta kiss the Blarney Stone and come right back.
Or like they may go to Italy to like have some good pasta and maybe look at the David, which, by the way, I want to go to Italy and look at the David, and look at the Sistine Chapel. Maybe go say hello to the Pope and then go home. Like Tony Soprano went to Italy to do more criminal stuff. Like, he didn't go to Italy because he felt Italian. What does it mean for leaders to be Americans? First off, Tom, what does it mean to be an American? What does that mean? Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to ask you the hard question. What does it mean to be an American?
I mean, have you ever seen, I think you and I might have talked about this briefly at one point, but there's a scene in, was it The Newsroom? I think it was, where
yes,
sitting on stage and there's a young college girl that says, why is America the best country in the world or whatever? And
right.
It was like a panel discussion, and Jeff Daniels just goes off. And if you actually sit there and listen to him, it's like that speech really resonated with me, right? Because to your point, and there's a lot of, there's another part to this too, that it's going to sound like a little bit of double talk here, but there's a lot of Americans that don't feel like America needs to be the police of the world, right? Like, we don't need to be the big brother of the world. We don't need to be Uncle Sam to every country across the world. So why is it always our responsibility to go in there and either help negotiate peace, support one of the, support one of the one of the fighting sides that we feel are on the side of good versus evil, whatever.
Right.
But like, but inevitably we do. And part of it, and if you go back to the reference that I was making with the newsroom with Jeff Daniels, is because it's not about being the richest country in the world or the best economics of the world, the land of the free, home of the brave. Like it's not about your rights and civil liberties that a lot of other countries have today. The United States is
Mm-hmm.
not the only country in the world anymore that is a democracy. More than
Mm-hmm.
half the countries in the world right now are democracy. They're considered a democracy. So
Mm-hmm.
they have a voice. Their population has a voice. They can vote. They can get their, new leadership in there. All that stuff exists. So when you but it go now again, like I said, it's going to sound a little bit like double
Yeah.
talk because when you go back to what it means to be an American, it's because at one point we stood up for something that was bigger than ourselves.
Right.
It's we stood in the way of injustices as a nation, even though there were injustices happening within our own borders.
Mm-hmm.
It was still something that we felt like yes, there are injustices, yes, there are things within our country that we don't think are perfect, but we can work on them internally. What we don't want to see is all of the things that are happening inside the US that are injustices become plagues on the outside. Like they
Mm-hmm.
become like things that run the world into the ground on the other side. So the United States stands on principle. And well, let me rephrase this. We used to stand on principle. Like
Oh, I think we still do. I think we still do stand on principle, but I don't necessarily think that it is always our leaders that stand on principle. I think the average American person on the street, I do. I fundamentally believe this because of the places I've been and the people that I've talked to.
yeah,
You know, any group of multicolored people in America, you get them in a room together, and I'm not talking about the elites with the status. Forget those
right.
people. They're out of the conversation. They're playing different games in a different sort of arena. But people who are making, $100,000 or $50,000, which is the vast majority of people in the United States, those people still have the American principle. They're matter of fact, they don't understand why the elites can't get on board with the principle.
But I mean, but to your point, but I think that's what it is. Like I think that it's almost like we sit on a high horse viewing everybody else beneath us as Americans, but yet we don't recognize that we sit on the high horse.
Right. Yeah. I
I
would
think
agree with
that's really what it is, right? Like we're gonna have some sort of moral high ground. Almost we're gonna stand on that moral high ground and we're gonna shout from the rooftops that we are standing on the moral high ground, even even when the moral high ground is not so high, right? Like we're not,
well, well,
but
to be
but,
said,
but we stand collectively on this moral high ground. Now, again, if you go back to like we're not always on the same page, sure. But when we're not on the same page, we generally speaking are still trying to do the right thing.
yeah,
That's the principle of it. Like we feel like we stand on the right side of the thought process. And we want to make sure that nobody else feels like they're getting suppressed like that in other countries, which is why we still feel now we can complain all we want about maybe we spend a little bit too much money, maybe we spend a little bit too much time or resources policing the rest of the world. Sure, if you want to cut that budget down, I'm okay with that, but that doesn't mean that we just don't do it anymore. Pre World War II or pre World War One, when if you think about pre World War One, the United States had a federal a national essentially a national not motto, but it was basically a rule of thumb where we just didn't get involved in international politics. We
right,
stayed to ourselves. We wanted to control what we could control and let the rest of the world fall to shit. Sorry, excuse my language. But post World War One, when we were forced to get involved in that war, that just went out the window. So
right,
now, like, and there's some shift now that people are like, well, we should probably get back to at least a little semblance of that, and
yeah,
which again would be cutting funding to underprivileged third world countries, cutting funding for, our military allies, like sure, if you want to cut some, but we can't just be non-existent anymore. Those days are gone.
right.
So
Well, and
it's
I
just a
also
matter of,
think
But we do feel, to your point, as Americans, what makes us Americans is that we do feel like we are on the moral high ground throughout the rest of the world.
Right. Well, and an inch above, when you're standing on a platform, an inch above somebody else, you are high. I mean, you are technically speaking higher than them, which is an
Yeah.
inch, but it's
Or
higher.
you're just
And,
high. You know,
or you're just high, right? Yeah, exactly. um, Now, I think what you said there is very important. Um, I would also add that we used to have leaders, because this is a leadership podcast, and this is one of my bugaboos for many years. We used to have leaders that explained to people what the hell they were getting into. So Roosevelt explained to people what the hell they were getting into. Um, even Truman and Eisenhower explained to people what they were getting into. Um, and it's that lack of explanation, I think, that's frustrating people. In addition to bureaucratic, opaque systems where no one seems to have any accountability. Meanwhile, I'm walking around in the world and I've got accountability left and right. And if I screw up, my kids don't eat. If I screw up, I get fired. If I right, so there's this disconnect, right? So you have an opaque bureaucratic system where no one or where very few leaders are bothering. And I'm looking Congress, I'm looking at you directly. You should be doing this, but very few people explain to the population what they're doing. Instead, you have activist talk or getting money from donors, from people, at $5,000 a plate deals, and not engaging in leadership. People, every person across the world wants leadership. This is a failure. Most of our problems in the last 20 years have been failures of leadership. By the way, both Republican and Democrat, I'm paying you both with the same brush. You
Sure.
failed at leadership. Okay. Lofty rhetoric or just telling me to go shopping is not leadership. it just ain't, that ain't it. Then the other dynamic that I think exists inside of there is, and I think this is very important, we've always had, and you see this in when you study the history of the Constitution. So one of the interesting things that came out when I was studying the history of the Federalist Papers was that Patrick Henry, Mr. Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, right, who was a great polemicist and narrator, and or not narrator, sorry, orator, and had great oratory skills, right? He was supposed to go to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia at the end of the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson actually told him to go as a representative of Virginia and Kentucky at the time. And Patrick Henry, and this is what I'm talking about. Patrick Henry turned Thomas Jefferson down because back then Thomas Jefferson wasn't Thomas Jefferson; he was just some dude, right? Which I think is great. And Patrick Henry was like, "No, I'm not going to go." And the line he has in the letter is, that he writes, and you can find this in the Anti-Federalist Papers, I think. He basically says, I smell a rat. I want the Articles of Confederation left the way they are. I don't want to be united with the rest of these people. Leave me alone. And that streak, and Murray references this with the Yankee backwoodsman. There is a streak of people that came over here on boats, and now it's in the DNA of the culture, who don't want government of any kind telling them what to do. They want to be their own kings. And this is the place, as far as they're concerned, this is the place where they can be their own kings. And so just leave them alone. Doral and I were talking about this, and we were talking about the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers a couple of years ago on the show. And Doral made this good point. He said, leave them alone and let them go up into the hills. Just leave them alone. Let those people go up in the hills. Because if you go up in the hills and you try to if the FBI does not go into the hills of North Carolina.
Yeah, Appalachian.
Right. Just leave those people alone. Just leave them the hell alone. Why would you?
That's why do you think the Cherokee went there on the Trail of Tears? They weren't following them there. There was a certain number of people from the Cherokee Nation that went up in the North Carolina hills, and the federal didn't follow them. They took everybody else. They just went.
Just leave me alone. I don't want to be part of your game. I don't want to play. And so that streak, which is a counter tension to the streak of we need to go out and help other people in the world, that's a massive tension in America. And it gets exposed when we have chaotic times. when we don't know what's going on, and when we have failures of leadership. Okay, so how do leaders define themselves then in the United States of America? And I always sort of define what it means to be an American, full of tension and all of that. How do leaders define themselves, their teams, and their cultures in the United States of America? If I'm starting a company and I have more than one person, or actually not even more than one, I got one person, congratulations, I'm a leader. And that person more likely than not is an American, more likely than not.
So, how do they define themselves? And I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I'm not sure I understand the question. Like,
Well,
do they like?
we've never really talked about this on the show, but um let me frame it this way. Should leaders allow all of that external stuff that doesn't seem to matter to the mission to come in to how they're running their thing, running their team or running their culture? Or because, like, I'm just thinking of a conversation I just had with somebody who's leading me, right, on a project that I'm working on. I literally just had it before I came here, before we hit record. And that person's perspective is uniquely American, even though their skin color is closer in pigmentation to mine. They're still an American. Like, there's things that come out of their mouth that you wouldn't hear come out of. There's just assumptions, not even things come out of their mouth. There's assumptions that are built into how they view the world, which is what Murray talks about: an assumption of freedom, an assumption of individual agency. And I love it when he makes the point in that section in the Omni-Americans that we just read. Harriet Tubman wasn't trying to get folks on the Underground Railroad back to Africa. It wasn't what she was trying to do. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
Yeah. The funny thing that there's also, I think it comes down to, there's a lot to unpack there, by the way.
Oh yeah. There's
like, you think about like from a leadership perspective, like, what is the culture of your company? Because I remember coming into the professional workforce, when I was outside of my, my high school days and the little side jobs that you do in high school. But when you start hitting the professional thing, your professional landscape, and there's like these unwritten rules, right? That leadership kind of talk like, shouldn't be talking politics in the office. You shouldn't be like, don't talk about religion in the office because, well, because they're not equipped to handle that kind of conflict resolution, right? Like if you have two employees that just, one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, and they just hate each other beyond belief, and you can't make them work with each other, like, how does that just translates that you're a bad leader? Whereas if you just kind of don't allow the conversations to happen in the first place, and you don't know what your political views are, or their political view, they don't know what your political views are, but you guys can coordinate to get this project done just fine. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of weird oddities there, right? That you just
Yeah, oh,
kind of
yeah.
have to decide what kind of. Now, on the flip side to this, there you can say that I'm the kind of leader that stands for this, that wants my
Mhm.
team to react like this, and if you can't get on board with that, then you shouldn't be here. So it's not about Democrat and Republican. It's not about Catholic and Judaism, or it's not a religious
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
It's about it's about principles and morals, and like, we're going to do this. Now, you can sit there and say, well, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, or I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, and we don't see eye to eye on anything. But if you don't know what your political stances are, but yet your company culture dictates this, and this, and you can stand behind that, does it really matter?
Hmm.
You know, like,
Hmm.
does your political view really matter? I love our current administration. I hate our current administration. I don't care about our current administration because they're going to be gone in a couple of years. Like,
Right.
you know, does any of that really matter if you have a project in front of you that needs all of your attention and that you can actually get something done? Like, stop talking about it. Like, we don't talk about Bruno.
Right.
Like, it's now, again, is that fair? No. Is it fair to say that when you're in your workplace that certain topics are off limits, that you shouldn't be able to express yourself? I mean, maybe not. I don't know. Like, again, it goes back to, like, think about a couple of years ago in the NFL when a lot of these players were kneeling down, and there was a lot of debate on who gets to control that. And then
Right.
we found out, by the way, and for those of you who don't know this,
Go ahead.
it can be controlled. This is an employer-employee conversation.
Turns out that
Turns
all those millionaires work for somebody.
right. Like, these people can be told, don't do that or you're fired. Like, I was even baffled by this. I was like, wait, what? I think that's a First Amendment kind of violation. And I guess it's not if it's yeah, your employer dictates how you act when you're being employed. So, and I was like,
You
holy
have no
crap.
First Amendment if you're getting a paycheck.
Right.
So,
Exactly. So anyway, so when you're asking, what are leaders supposed to, or how do they define themselves? I think that you've got a handful of things that you have to be very selective about.
right.
You have principles, you have, like, guiding principles that tell you or dictate to you that in order for me to make money, I still need to satisfy this moral compass or these principles that I stand on. And if I can't stand on these principles and make that money, then I don't take that money. And I
Right.
think that's a very powerful thing for employees to see, because then you can decide what kind of company you want to work for, what kind of leader do you want to work for, and it's relatively clear and transparent that this company, like, we talk about in another project that you and I are partnering in. We talk about being public benefit corporations, companies like
Mhm.
Patagonia, where their mission is to save the environment in one jacket at a time, or whatever, however they word it.
Mhm.
I'm not a marketing person for them, so I have no idea how they word it. But and I don't buy a lot of their products just because they're expensive, but no other reason than that. But if you want to go work for Patagonia and you say, all right, I know if I go to work for these companies, I will never have to bend on this principle, and
Right.
that's why I want to go work for them. That's great. If you can define yourself on principle, you can define yourself on moral compass. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, what you
Mhm.
just can't define yourself as on profit margin. Like, when you
Yeah.
tell people, I'm going to be the kind of leader that just makes us all a lot of money, that seems to be the weakest link in that chain of how I can define myself.
Yeah. Well, it only really works. And then we'll go back to the book. I want to say something about that because I think you've hit on something there as well. Profit margin only really works when everyone is getting rich together,
Yeah.
and almost no time is 100% everyone getting rich together. Like
Right.
it's just, that's just sort of not sort of, that's just reality.
Right.
So there's going to be stratifications. There's going to be people in the middle. There's going to be people at the bottom. And there's going to be people at the top. And we are so historically and culturally And I can see it when I read books from authors like Albert Murray, who were writing in the 60s and 70s, or Eldridge Cleaver, who we just covered on the podcast, wrote Soul on Ice, right? Or Malcolm X, right? We are hidebound, regardless of political party, we are hidebound to a phantasmagoric vision of the middle of the 20th century that probably wasn't the truth. And that vision of the middle 20th century was a vision of, if you're a Democrat, top tax rate was, 65%, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there'll be no wartime millionaires. And then we're going to, we're going to reduce that to, 40%, and it's going to stay that way until Kennedy, and he's only going to bring it down to like 30%, and then Reagan only really brought it down to like 20% or something like that. And we're going to take your money, right? But corporations are going to respond to that by getting in bed with unions, who are going to engage in policies by pitting one employer against another across the street, and it's all going to work out. And that's if you're on the left. If you're on the right, a man can make enough money to be the sole provider, sole breadwinner in his home, and the woman can stay home and raise the kids. And there's social norming that comes from the neighborhood. It comes from people knowing who their neighbors are. It comes from people understanding that religion, whether you believe in it or not, is an irrelevancy. Get you behind a church, heathen. like this, and this is from the right, like the cultural things, right? And so we're both the right and the left in America are hidebound to this vision of the mid 20th century. And because people change and times change, even though they don't always change that much, but people change, times change. And so we move forward, right? And again, a failure of leadership, right? We don't have leaders. And I used to think it would be the elite leaders, as I already mentioned. But now I think it has to be the guy or the woman who's in that business who has to be the example of leadership. I got on this a couple of years ago. I don't think we can rely on the congressman or even the mayor of your town, and I won't even go as high as the president, forget that guy, or even your national congressman. Your local congressman, your local mayor can't be the leader for you. You've got to be the leader. You've got to be the leader in your family. You've got to be the leader in your community. I don't care whether you're a man or a woman, it doesn't matter to me. Be the leader, right? Be the person who stands up and does that, because that's the only way we're going to evolve into something else from that hidebound phantasmagoric vision that we all seem to be trapped by. By the way, here's a side note on that. I've been thinking lately that 500 years from now, when they write the history of this era and we're all dead and gone and the podcast is scrubbed from the internet and it won't matter,
it's gonna be archived, Tayson. We're gonna live. We're gonna live forever.
It could be archived. Oh God, please, no, please just scrub me from the internet. It's fine. But 500 years from now, when they write the history of this era, and everybody who lived here is gone, I wonder if they will look at the mid 20th century as being an outlier, not the norm, the outlier. Because there were certain unique historical things that occurred, particularly between 1939 and 1945, that were linchpin that everything else circled around. And it took people a while to figure out, took people a half century, almost a full century to figure out how to get back to a norm. I've been thinking about that quite a bit. And that has implications for leaders. That has implications for leaders in communities. That has implications for leaders in towns and cities. And even implications for leadership in your family. We can't be hidebound by the past. I mean, think about it this way. We have an entire generation of people that's being born right now, of which my youngest son, who's 8, is part of that generation, who have zero historical memory of the 20th century at all. It will always be a history book thing for them. It won't be something that they were born into. It will be something that is way past to them. And for many of us, that's weird to think about.
Yeah, but that's happened already a few times, right? Like if you think about it, like all the westward expansion, manifest destiny, all that stuff up until 1890. If you were born in the early, like Albert Murray here was born in 1916, sorry, 1916. to him, that entire thing was a history book,
Right.
right?
Oh,
Like,
I'm not
so
saying it hasn't happened before.
yeah, I was saying, like, so we talk about this a lot, and my favorite phrase has been on this podcast about 100 times so far, which
Yep.
is like, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Like,
Right.
we've got we keep doing this same thing over and over. It's like the
It's
human
the
race is the definition of insanity.
it's the human condition. A
Yeah.
good friend of our, a mutual friend of ours, would say that in his courses. His ethics courses. It's the human condition, and he's exactly right. He's not wrong. It's the human condition. You know. All right. Back to the book. Here's another piece of the human condition: transferring wisdom. Talk about going from generation to generation. How do you do that? All right, back to the book. Back to the Omni-Americans by Albert Murray. And I quote: as an art form, the blues idiom, by its very nature, goes beyond the objective of making human existence bearable physically or psychologically. The most elementary and hence the least dispensable objective of all serious artistic expression, whether aboriginal or sophisticated, is to make human existence meaningful. Man's primary concern with life is to make it as significant as possible, and the blues are part of this effort. The definitive statement of the epistemological assumptions that underlie the blues idiom may well be the colloquial title and opening declaration of one of Duke Ellington's best known dance tunes from the mid 30s. By the way, I love that sentence. He managed to put in epistemological, idiom, and colloquial all in the same sentence. Love this guy. Of Duke Ellington's best known dance tune from the mid 30s. Quote, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. In any case, when the Negro musician or dancer swings the blues, he is fulfilling the same fundamental existential requirement that determines the mission of the poet, the priest, and the medicine man. He is making an affirmative and hence exemplary and heroic response to that which Andre Malraux describes as la condition humaine, the human condition. Extemporizing in response to the exigencies of the situation in which he finds himself, he is confronting, acknowledging, and contending with the infernal absurdities and ever impending frustrations inherent in the nature of all existence by playing with the possibilities that are also there. This does not mean that the player become man, um, the stylizer, and by the same token, the humanizer of chaos. And thus does play become ritual, ceremony, and art. And thus does also the dance beat improvisation of experience in the blues idiom become survival technique, aesthetic equipment for living, and a central element in the dynamics of U.S. Negro lifestyle. When the typical Negro dance orchestra plays the blues, it is also playing with the blues. When it swings, jumps, hops, stomps, bounces, drags, shuffles, rocks, and so on, its manner not only represents a swinging the blues attitude toward the bad news that comes with the facts of life, it also exemplifies and generates a riffing the blues disposition toward the rough times that beset all human existence. The blues idiom dancer, like the solo instrumentalist, turns disjunctures into continuities. He is not disconcerted by intrusions, lapses, shifts in rhythm, intensification of tempo, for instance, but is inspired by them to higher and richer levels of improvisation. As a matter of fact, and as the colloquial sense of the word suggests, the break in the blues idiom provides the dancer his greatest opportunity, which at the same time is also his most heroic challenge and his moment of greatest jeopardy. By the way, that's an excellent description of what happens in a blues song, or even in a jazz song. But then impromptu heroism, such as is required only of the most agile of storybook protagonists, is precisely what the blues tradition has evolved to condition Negroes to regard as normal procedure. Nor is there any other attitude towards experience more appropriate to the ever shifting circumstances of all Americans, or more consistent with the predicament of man in the contemporary world at large. Indeed, the blues idiom represents a major American innovation of universal significance and potential because it fulfills, among other things, precisely that fundamental function that Constance Rourke ascribes to the comedy, the irreverent wisdom, the sudden changes and adroit adaptation she found in the folk genre of the Yankee backwoodsman Negro of the era of Andrew Jackson. It provides, quote, emblems for a pioneer people who require resilience as a prime trait. I like that description of what's happening in the blues, because you can see it on the floor. You can see it when you go to a blues club or when you go to a jazz club. Um, You can also see it in the struggle that people have, and this is why I read that section, the struggle that people have in distributing through improvisation and idiom, not necessarily dance, but this idea that Murray has of style through transmitting wisdom. What have you learned from this improvisation? What can other people pick up from it? And this is not something new. I mean, everybody has struggled with wisdom transfer. When I was writing this script, I thought of some of the sections in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, right? When the old men were talking to the young men who wanted to go off and fight the white people, wanted to kill them all, and let God sort them out. And well, that's the Hasan translation. And and the old men were like, might not be a good idea. Or you see it in feminist writings when we covered books by Zora Neale Hurston or Virginia Woolf, talking about and engaging in opposition to older female writers like Jane Austen, or earlier female writers like Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, right? You also in African American writers like Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, who were in rank opposition to the wisdom of a previous generation. There's an excellent essay in Eldridge Cleaver's book, Soul on Ice, where he describes being on the prison yard and an older Black man basically shuts the young bucks up with some wisdom that they don't want to hear. And they don't have anything to say. And it's probably his best essay in that book. Wisdom. Wisdom can come through culture transfer, right? And in the United States, we do have unique pieces of culture. We have blues, we have jazz, we have baseball. I threw movies in there and cinema, even though we ripped that off from the French and then made it better. We're almost the BASF of countries. Oh, we did. Oh, we did. Come on, let's be real here.
I wasn't arguing.
Pardon my French, viewers and listeners. When was the last great French film? Don't worry. I await with bated breath your emails and your tweets. But when we think about the modes of cultural transfer and wisdom transfer, those idiomatic identifiers of class, culture, and race also come through, and they also impact that wisdom transfer, but eventually they fall away, right? Revealing the core elements that need to be preserved over the course of time. We have a real struggle in our own era because of technology. The writer that we just covered on the podcast, Walter Benjamin, talked about this in the 1930s in The Storyteller, talked about how the novel basically destroyed the oral tradition. The technology of the novel and the technology of the printing press destroyed the oral tradition. And I am of the opinion that cell phones and social media and the internet in general, because cell phones and social media are sort of built on top of that, but the internet in general has destroyed wisdom transfer because everything is right now. Everything is in the present, right? To your point earlier, about me being scrubbed from the internet. Yeah, I might be archived in the Internet Wayback Machine, but eventually no one's going to care, right? Because I'm in the Internet Wayback Machine. I think this is a real challenge for leaders, and I think it is one of the core things that we are struggling with. And so, Tom, how can we transfer wisdom, particularly to the young bucks that don't want to hear it, from generation to generation?
This again is probably one of the tougher questions here, because again, like to your point, so sometimes let me rephrase your question, because I think there's a component that's missing from the question. So how do leaders transfer wisdom across generations without compromise? That
Okay.
there's because the transfer of wisdom with compromise is a lot easier, and it's a lot easier to stomach. For example, I'll just take our own culture as a very easy or quick example, right? So you're teaching a younger kid how to a particular dance. Let's say like a men's northern fancy dance or something like that. Not that any of our listeners are going to have a clue what I'm talking about, but let's stay with me for a second. So when you're trying to transfer that wisdom into why the regalia is designed the way it is, what it's supposed to look like, what it means to wear that regalia, and then enter the circle and dance in a particular style that's very traditional and generational. It's been crossing generations for a long time. And that younger kid says, yeah, but I don't, my moccasins hurt my feet. Can I wear my sneakers? And you compromise and say, yeah, it's just a pair of sneakers. Go ahead, go wear your sneakers. Right?
Mm.
Where the like, so as a leader, you have to decide, is the wisdom of that overall dance, regalia style, dance style, education behind why it exists, where it exists, and for what, is it important enough to compromise this one thing that he doesn't want to wear moccasins and he wants to wear sneakers? And if the answer is yes, then that transfer of wisdom from generation to generation is successful. If it is not, and you try to reinforce why they should be wearing the moccasins, and it's lost on them and they don't want to dance anymore because moccasins hurt their feet, and they're not going to dance unless they can wear their sneakers.
Mm.
Right? Like, so again, it's there. I think generational wisdom transference has compromise all over the place, and we just don't recognize it because it's subtle. Or at least I don't think we try to view it as transfer of knowledge or transfer of wisdom, but there's always these compromises that we're so subtly willing to give into. And I think that for us to stand firm and say we're not giving into these compromises anymore, I think that would be devastating. I think that the younger generation would just stop listening to us altogether. There's a different style of transfer of wisdom where you're not physically preaching and teaching, or you're physically not talking. But I'll give you another example of this. I have 5 children. My youngest daughter was almost never punished. She was almost never in trouble. And from an outsider looking in, they go, oh, it's because she was the baby and she was spoiled. No, it's because she watched what her older brothers and sisters got in trouble for and didn't do those things.
Didn't do those things. Yeah. Yeah.
She was a student. She was a student of her environment. She didn't need anybody to transfer that wisdom to her. She did it on her own by watching and observing what was happening in our family unit and saying, I'm not doing that. So can that happen in the workforce? Absolutely. I did the same thing when I was really early in my career. I worked in the restaurant industry, and I was trying to move up the managerial chain, so to speak, and become a general manager. And every manager that I worked under, if they got in trouble for something, mental note, I'm not doing that. Whatever that guy just got in trouble for, got yelled at about, or got rid of, like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to make a note. I'm going to learn from that on my own. Nobody has to teach me that. Nobody has to tell me that. I'm going to observe it and learn it on my own. I think part of what we're seeing and what you're talking about, especially from the social media components, people aren't doing that anymore. People aren't observing, like, people are seeing people get famous on TikTok or whatever, not realizing that they're sacrificing their entire family unit. They're not spending real quality time with their family. They're suffering from loneliness and depression and all this other stuff. But what they're learning is, look at the number of likes that they get, or number of followers they get, or number of views they get on their videos. It's the transfer of wisdom is still there. Well, let me rephrase this. The transfer of information is still there, but is it truly wisdom? Is
Yeah.
again another part of the question. Because that's another thing that, and that's the younger generation, when they're looking at us and we're trying to explain something or tell, I can't even tell you, Hasan, how many times my youngest son has come to me and said the words, Dad, you were right. Because I don't force feed it down his throat anymore. I tell him my thoughts, I give him my opinions, I tell him what I would do, and then he goes and does his own thing. He makes his own mistakes. And then when he comes back and says, Dad, you were right, I go, okay, now do you want help fixing this? And then the answer is yes, and it's genuine. He actually wants it. If we don't allow young people to make some of their own mistakes, then this transfer of wisdom is not going to happen either.
So, okay. So you said a bunch of different things there, and
I said a lot of things.
Yeah, you said a lot of things there, and they're all valuable. No, I think so. The thing that I land on is the challenge of holding the line. And it's not really the challenge of holding the line, it's the challenge of knowing where the line is. So if I'll pick something obvious, right? So yeah, I'll pick an outrageous, obvious one. Murder is murder is murder all the time, right? Like, okay, like, okay. And yet, we can have conversations, and we do in this society, both about abortion and the death penalty, although less about the death penalty as of late. Of the last 10 or 15 years, that has sort of faded out of the public conversation. But I think that'll start coming back in a few years here, as well as conversations about euthanasia. And remember Jack Kevorkian? Yeah, that's going to come back. I think
physician-assisted suicide.
There you go. Yeah. Well, even that acronym right there, right? Physician-assisted suicide, right? And as a person who's fascinated by language, I am convinced more and more every day that the battle of reality is a battle of who owns the dictionary, who gets to define the words that are in it, and who gets to define what words even go in it in the first place. So I guess the question out of all of that comes to me is, because I loved your example about sneakers versus moccasins. What is the line we're preserving there? Can we articulate that? Can we articulate why the moccasins are better than the sneakers? And can we do it in a way that honors the person who wants to wear sneakers, but that also honors or creates a great chain of being going back to the people who wore moccasins? And by the way, this is sort of what I think about. I always, not always, when conversations like this occur, and when we're making points like this, I think of my grandma, right? And my grandmother would have ordered groceries off the internet if she'd had it in like 1930, whatever. Like, she would have used that. So it's not the sneakers, maybe. It's the line, it's the chain of being, right? From the moccasins to the sneakers. How do we talk with people about that? How do we do that in a way that's compelling for them to even listen to? Because to your point, it can just come off as information and not actual wisdom.
Yeah. So I again, I think part of it is, is principally driven, right? So again, I'll give you, and again, to your point, I'm not going to sit here and view or judge the way that somebody teaches their family and their compromise, and I'm not going to judge them based on what I'm willing to compromise or not compromise, because just for the record, not a single one of my kids would dare step foot in one of our ceremonial circles with sneakers on. Okay. They're wearing their moccasins. If they're in regalia, they're in their moccasins. It's that simple. And I think part of it is because I feel like, from a family perspective, we put a tremendous amount of weight on if our most recent ancestor was alive, would they approve? And if the answer is, to your point, and by the way, there are a lot of things that they would approve on. For example, like my mentor and father-in-law and teacher, who passed away in 2020, he would say all the time, like, why would you not use a hand drill, like a power drill? Our ancestors would use that if they had it available, right? Like they would use that. Now, would our ancestors use sneakers instead of moccasins in the circle? Probably not. And the reason I say that is because sneakers are not new. Sneakers have been around for 100 years. And our ancestors from 75 years ago wouldn't wear sneakers in there. 50 years ago, wouldn't wear sneakers in there. This is a very modern thing that the next generation is trying to do. So it's, we don't have to go back 200 years. This is not something that we're trying to hold on to for no reason. Like, this is something that now again, I go back, let me switch gears here, because there's a completely different, and if anybody listens to this podcast that happens to be native, I'm going to just make a little bit of a distinction here, a distinction with a difference.
Mm-hmm.
You're at a powwow that's a competition powwow versus a powwow that's a ceremonial powwow. It's different. When you're at a
Mm-hmm.
competition powwow, the comfort of your feet are important. You also can't slip and fall. And there's a lot of things that sneakers actually there's a benefit to
Mm-hmm.
versus a ceremonial powwow where it's not about that. It's not about competition. It's not about winning. It's not about winning a prize piece of prize money, or it's not about that. It's about paying homage to our ancestors. That's the point of it. So again, there's a little bit of a distinction with a difference there. So very traditional people who are who go to these two different versions of powwows may have two different pieces of wisdom to give to their kids, grandkids, great grandkids as they're learning how to interact with this environment. So from a leadership perspective in the workforce, maybe there's this similar applications here where it's, do as I say, not as I do in this case, but not in this one. Like I'm going to lead by example in this case, but do as I say, not as I do in this case. And it may make sense,
Right.
but as a leader, you have to make it make sense. You
It makes
can't
sense.
say it and call it martial law. Like it doesn't work that way. Especially today's workforce. Today's workforce needs to know the why. They need to
Right.
have an understanding of, like, you're asking them to run through a brick wall, and I'm willing to do it, but I need to know that my willingness to do it is going to be worth it for both for you, myself, and my principals.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's again, I think that could be a podcast all by itself. Like
Yeah.
these kinds of this kind of question.
Well, and it is you're right. And it is the question that we are going to be covering on this podcast for the remainder of the year. It's one of those things that I think is going to be key for us as leaders to wrap arms around, particularly as we switch over from being in, and again, I'm going to keep saying it, I'm going to speak it into reality as we switch over from being in chaos, and in chaotic times, to being in what I do fundamentally believe is going to be a cultural high. I do. I think we're poised for that. People are tired of the chaos. People are tired of nonsense. People do want wisdom. That's they finally come around to, this is the thing we're missing. We do need to get back on track. A lot of the things that we've talked about here today, and what does on track mean? What does wisdom mean? These are conversations that are worthwhile to have. Um, and every generation has them. It's just, how are we going to get that knowledge across? How are we going to get that wisdom across? Um, every generation has to relearn the wisdom of the previous generation, just because there to be table stakes, right? And just, this is what you show up for, and this is what it is. Um, Around understanding reality and existing in the world and preserving the gift of feedback. Um, I also think that there's some technologies, and I'm kind of obsessed with this idea now. There's some technologies that are better for transmitting this wisdom. So, you know, I don't know that I'm not down on the novel. Otherwise, why would I be doing this podcast? But I do think that there are some inherent challenges in the fragmentation of information, that we haven't really gotten our arms around. And what I worry about, and I've said this last year on the podcast, I maybe not worry. What I caution, right, is that people our age who did go through all the chaos and do have genuine wisdom, I don't want to see us shuffled to the side like those pair of moccasins just left in the corner, right? Um, because the kinds of things we've learned from going through the hard chaos of the last 20 years at various levels, is valuable. There is a value to that, and it does need to be transmitted. All right, final thoughts on Albert Murray. Final thoughts on the Omni-Americans as we close today. Last word, Tom.
Uh, I honestly, I think if somebody's listening to this podcast and it sparks their interest even a little bit, Googling this guy is easy. And there is, like I said, there's a tremendous amount of information about him. Not even just about, not even just him himself doing interviews, but the sheer volume of people that speak about this guy in the ways in the it's fascinating. So the last word for me would be, if anything on this podcast has struck your attention or really has resonated with you and you want to learn more about Albert Murray, I would highly recommend you go and just Google the guy and start listening to some of the interviews with him. I saw an interview with him, the one you shared with Hamilton College. I saw an interview with him with Charlie Rose, who was a journalist back in the day. Like, he did a TV show. I forget what the name of the TV show was, but it was
Yes,
a
he did.
TV
Charlie
show.
Rose show.
Yeah, and he interviewed him. The interview with him was exceptionally well done. There was another thing that was doing, it was like, believe it or not, it was an anti-Semitism not convention, but it was an anti-Semitism
A conference or something.
collective or conference or something like that.
Yeah.
There were several doctoral people talking about him and his works and how they interacted with modern society and why it's important. And the fact that the guy wrote what, 5 or 6 books in 5 years or 6 years, from 1970 to 1976, he produced almost all of his literature. It was fascinating. He's fascinating. He's fascinating. He was smart. And as you read some of the excerpts from the book and you yourself were impressed at some of the word combinations that he used in a single sentence, the guy was sharp, and he was sharp all the way until the last interview he did, which I believe was the early 2000s, I think 2006 or 7, maybe it was 2008. But he was sharp as a tack. The guy knew his stuff. He knew who he was. He was principled. And I think the other thing that I thought was interesting about him, I found it fascinating that he was able to talk about racial issues, not from a position of hate, violence, or like that you need, like, forced understanding, I guess is the other word I was thinking of. He always spoke of it from a experiential, influential, and educational perspective. Again, think about the time frame that he grew up in, and Black people in America, and that in almost through most of his life were not treated all that great. But yet he had no animosity. Like, that's the other thing too. Like, it wasn't thinking the world didn't owe him anything. He was able to succeed through it. He would, like, all the things that he talks about he's always positive. So to your point about transfer of some wisdom, I think that the world today could learn a lot from him. I really do. I think that the world today could learn a lot from him. White, Black, Asians, Native, doesn't matter. I think that all of us could just listen to him talk. It was impressive. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Albert Murray.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, for visiting us today, joining us today on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And with that, well, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.